All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know we'll have participants kind of trickle in, but I just want to make sure we start on time so we can honor everybody's time. Thank you for being here. My name is Gaithel Patel, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Arts Administration and Education and Policy Department here at The Ohio State University. I'm very honored to be able to help present the Barnett Symposium Speaker Series and to present having Dr. Tyler Denmead join us for the Creative Underclass, Youth, Race, and the Gentrifying City talk today. You are our kickoff speaker, so welcome. We're very glad that you're here, and we really appreciate your time and energy for being part of this session. I just want to give a quick thank you and an overview for the session, and then I'm going to hand it off so we can get started. So again, welcome everyone. I have a few thank yous to say for making this Barnett Symposium Speaker Series come together in kind of a quick turnaround and making sure all these pieces can happen. So many people in our department make this happen. So I just want to make sure I give a shout out to Brittany Shelton and Michelle Adius and Lauren Pace, Dr. Skaggs and Dr. Goldberg Miller, Dr. Balji Morris and Dr. Funk for being so supportive and making sure all of these pieces could actually come together and actually support the Barnett Symposium Speaker Series. I'm really honored to work with all of you and have an opportunity to do this. What we'll do is we'll have Dr. Tyler Denmead present and actually have a good 45 minutes to share and really give us this opportunity to hear about the book. And then we will actually shift over to a Q&A. We are using the webinar format, and so that'll give us the ability to actually record the presentation. And then if at the Q&A time, if anybody would like to turn on their cameras or anything like that, you can just shoot me a note in the chat. And I'm happy to turn on your camera at that point, or you can use the chat feature and I'm happy to moderate that. And we can do a Q&A and chat at the end point at that moment. So that's what we'll be doing throughout this webinar format and actually moving forward so that we can actually engage and connect in this nice way on a Friday, kind of through a lunch and learn. So welcome, thanks for joining us for lunch, or if you're globally somewhere else, thank you for joining us at a different time around the world. And it's my greatest honor to actually introduce the chair of our department, Dr. Karen Hutzel, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. So thank you for being here. We're honored that everybody's joining us for this.
Thanks, Kettle. Thanks for kicking us off. So I want to say a little bit about the Barnett Symposium, a brief history and what we're doing now in this virtual world that we're living in, and then introduce our speaker. So in 1993, two endowed funds were established by Lawrence Barnett and Isabel Bigley Barnett to support the Arts Policy and Administration Program. One aspect of this endowment was the development of a biennial Barnett Symposium, which was created to facilitate in-depth inquiry and analysis of public and non-for-profit sector policies and practices. So Harold Williams, the president of J. Paul Getty Trust at the time, presented a lecture at the inaugural symposium in May of 1993. In his talk, Williams described the evolution and complex nature of the federal, state, and local arts support network and its significance for arts education policy formulation. Williams emphasized the interrelatedness of the arts and arts education, as well as the close linkage of arts education policy formulation to the overall reform of public education. Since that time, we've had many on-site symposia over the years, and our last one was a celebration of, anniversary celebration of the department 50 years, the symposium for 25 years, and the newest, youngest Barnett member of our family, the Barnett Center, for 5 years. We have a lot of things named Barnett in this department for good reasons. Obviously, this past year, as we started planning for our next on-campus symposium, COVID hit and happened and sent us all home. And as we regrouped and thought about how we might move forward and learned the ways of this virtual world, we decided to pilot the symposium in a spread out online format, with the possibility of it extending well beyond this year, in a virtual format, as well as the possibility of continuing on campus symposia at the same time. So it just gives us an opportunity, I believe, to invite speakers from all over the world, who maybe can't just join us at one moment in time, but could meet with us at any point during the year. And this year, we, as we launch this pilot, we're really lucky to have somebody from across the pond, as they say, who has visited us before. We were trying to figure out how long ago it was, and it was 4 years ago that Dr. Tyler Denmeade visited us in person in the Barnett Center in Sullivan Hall, while he was working on his the book that he's going to talk about. He was in the midst of writing it, and we engaged in a really exciting conversation with some graduate students who are still with us, and some who have since graduated and moved on. So I am really excited to have him back. He teaches in the Faculty of Education at Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. His most recent journal articles can be found in Studies in Art Education, the Journal of Curriculum and Pedagogy, and the Journal of Cultural Research in Art Education. And we are, of course, excited to have him share with us his work of his most recent book, The Creative Underclass, Youth, Race, and the Gentrifying City. And I'll just say very briefly that I was super excited when this came out. And yet I find it's taking me quite a while to read through it, because it's a personally critical, reflective analysis that I think needs to be done by any of us working in cities and working with youth of color. So thank you for your contributions, Dr. Denmeade, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hutzel. Let me get my screen set up for you all. Okay, so I trust what you're looking at right now is my slides and myself in the bottom corner. So thank you all for being here this morning, this afternoon, this evening. It's about 4 o'clock here in the UK. I appreciate that, Zoom time is a very precious, we have to be very precious with our Zoom time. And so I do really appreciate that you're spending your time here with me. Thank you so much to Gaithel Patel for organizing, for helping out with the organization of this. She's been amazing throughout this process. And yes, it's wonderful to be back with Ohio State. That presentation 4 years ago, I have to say I probably wrote 3 or 4 drafts of this book after that presentation. And that presentation was off, or that discussion was often a touch point for me as I was redrafting over the next 2 years. So thank you all again for being here. Okay, so the direction for this book project took a dramatic turn when I encountered this social media post from one of my research participants about the time I was presenting at Ohio State in 2017. And this person participated as a high school student in the youth organization that I founded in 1997. And this organization, New Urban Arts, was the topic of my book. And in this post, this young person puts out a call to their social network to discuss a contradiction that they were experiencing. On the one hand, they noted that they had benefited from nonprofit organizations in the city as a young person growing up in the aughts. And we can assume that one of those organizations was New Urban Arts. They were a regular participant there. On the other hand, they felt that these organizations were, as they put it here, gentrifying forces. Put otherwise, they felt they had benefited individually from organizations such as New Urban Arts, but those same organizations, they believed, factored in the displacement of low-income communities and those in communities of color from their neighborhoods. And this contradiction was complicated for them because they grew up as a young person, racialized as Latino in a neighborhood now being threatened by gentrification. So trying to reckon with this contradiction and my own entanglement in it as an educational leader, as an artist educator, became the focus of the book. I wanted to illuminate and understand how discourses of youth and race, as well as practices in arts and education, become entangled in mobilizing the reconfiguration of urban neighborhoods in the US. And my hope is that the critical perspective I put forward in the book makes us better equipped to tackle racial, economic, and youth justice in cities moving forward. And in this talk, what I want to do is just introduce a few ethnographic snapshots that crystallize how I think this concept of the creative underclass is useful for understanding this contradiction and how to move forward amidst it. Here's the timeline of this book project, which in many ways dates back to 1997, if not just a little bit earlier. And it's a fairly complicated timeline. So let me just kind of walk you through it a little bit. So I founded New Urban Arts in 1997 with peers from Brown University and the Rhode Island School of Design. I was a senior at Brown at the time, and I did it in partnership with public high school students and through the support of the Public Service Institute at Brown. And then I spent the next decade trying to build this program and sustain this organization. And then I left in 2007. I left to go to graduate school. I left the country. And then I returned in 2012. This was never my plan, but it just worked out that that was the one job that I got after graduate school. So I became a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Public Humanities at Brown. And there I got to return to New Urban Arts, this time to do some ethnographic research. And during this time, you'll notice two efforts by Providence mayors to drive urban renewal through arts, culture, and creativity. The first one's in 1998, when the then mayor Cianci branded Providence the Renaissance City. And with this initiative, he introduced tax incentives for the production and sales of art in downtown Providence, amongst other policies and projects. And New Urban Arts was, being founded at that time, and we were first based in an apartment in a church in downtown Providence in this new district that was being, identified as the arts district, the Down City Arts District. The second initiative comes later, 2009, when Mayor Cicilline brands Providence the creative capital. So you'll see a shift here from the Renaissance City to the creative capital. And this is largely being inspired by Richard Florida's thesis that the creative class is a key force in making cities more economically competitive and socially vibrant. Florida did visit Providence, I think around 2004, to begin and launch this conversation around creativity in the city. Okay, so that's the general timeline for the project. And now let me just briefly introduce you to New Urban Arts and what it's about. So it frames its purpose in relation to the systematic denial of creative learning opportunities for low-income youth and those youth in communities of color. And it intervenes by offering a host of programs that are oriented around this long-term goal to enable young people and artists, mentors to work together as collaborators and peers in developing creative practices that allow them to become more imaginative and active community members, or one might say to become artists who animate our social lives. Here's some images of what the studio looks like today. It's a two-story studio. It's around probably 4,000 square feet. It's located in close proximity to several public high schools. Providence is a little strange where it has 4 huge public high schools all within kind of a mile radius. And we located New Urban Arts there for obvious reasons. Young people could just walk there after school and participate for free. And the studio is full of spaces for making, studying, and hanging out. And hundreds of teenagers now stream through its doors each year. And over time, they really just find out about the place through word of mouth from their peers. Printmaking, fashion design, poetry have always been some of its more popular disciplines, but those change year to year depending on who's there, what interests young people and what artists are there in the studio and what their interests are. Notable alumni and participants of New Urban Arts featured on its Wikipedia site include Monty Hume, who's a youth participant who became a critically acclaimed web animator. Jamila Woods, a volunteer from Brown University, who's now a highly respected singer, songwriter, and poet. And the studio has received several awards and distinctions, including recognition by First Lady Michelle Obama as one of the best youth programs in the US. And here she's standing with one of New Urban Arts' former youth participants. So when I returned to New Urban Arts in 2012, 5 years after leaving it as its director, I was still really just curious about the pedagogic practices of the studio. I mean, to be honest, in the first decade, most of my time was trying to build this organization, build organizational structures, raise money, and so on. And so as much as I did have kind of my hands in the pedagogic practices of the studio, I wasn't necessarily participating as directly as perhaps I might have liked. And returning in 2012, this time in a more kind of ethnographic capacity, I was really excited about that opportunity and answering some of these still kind of live and unanswered questions about what is this place and what does it do? And that might sound strange since I played a key role in making the thing happen, but it always remained a bit of a puzzle as to how the place operated, how it worked, and how it didn't. But I wanted to focus on something, young people use a variety of words to describe it, but one was just its magic, the magic of New Urban Arts. And so what is this magic? And that was sort of just one of the starting questions that I began with. So dozens of young people stream through those doors every afternoon after school, and they do a variety of things, from hanging out to making art, to playing games, to working on administrative projects that support the organization, to preparing for performances and exhibitions and fashion shows and poetry readings and so on. And the studio is a joyous and irreverent place in the afternoons. It's full of laughter, it's swelling with energy. And it's also a very messy place with various projects. Some are finished, some are not yet finished, some will probably never be finished. And all these projects are kind of unfolding on their own timelines and their own corners of the studio. So it's a messy place. And these conditions are perhaps best reflected in this quote from a zine that was produced by youth participants and artist mentors when reflecting on the studio the year before I returned in 2012, where New Urban Arts is a place where young people come together to make a lot, make together, and celebrate what they make until what they make ends up on the floor. And what is significant about this quote for me is that the joy of making together and celebrating that making is perhaps more important than what is being made. Making is key to the social life of New Urban Arts, and what is being made is this vibrant learning community. This representation of New Urban Arts resonates, of course, with other scholarship on similar community-based arts education programs that take place, as Michelle Fine and her collaborators put it, beyond the borders of schooling. These authors describe young people using these programs to create real and imaginary spaces for corners for peace, solace, communion, personal and collective identity work. However, when I saw the social media post that I began this talk with about the contradiction of nonprofit and organizations in Providence, I realized that if I wanted to understand the personal and collective identity work happening in New Urban Arts after school, then I needed to look beyond the borders of the studio. And looking beyond the borders of New Urban Arts produced a lot of disciplinary anxieties for me. I'm not an urban studies and planning scholar. I'm not a geography scholar. I was not trained as an urban sociologist. I was trained as an educationalist with an interest in artist pedagogy. And there are endless debates in those fields about what gentrification means, how it happens, whether it is happening, whether or not it should happen, and what to do about it. Nonetheless, I mean, I knew I needed to account for gentrification in Providence in some way to understand this contradiction. In using the term gentrifying city in the subtitle of the book, I was drawing largely on this thesis, which I think I found just after I came to Ohio State. This is a thesis, a master's thesis at MIT by Faye Strongen, which is a great mixed method study of gentrification in Providence. And her analysis captures reflections from community development, housing, and urban planning professionals working in Providence who feared that the city was on the cusp of systematically displacing low-income communities from their neighborhoods, particularly in the west and south sides of the city. And there was an expressed desire from them to prevent a repeat of Brown University's displacement of the Cape Verdean community from the Fox Point neighborhood in the 1970s and 80s, which is on the east side of Providence. Incidentally, someone just mailed me a book today out of the blue by Devarian Baldwin, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, which I was thinking about in relation to Providence and this phenomenon. So that is a book to read. But in her quantitative analysis, Strongen focuses on indicators, including an analysis of rent growth and demographic changes in neighborhoods, including young adult share, white share, and Latino share of the population. And this slide shows her findings. The darker shade of blue-green signifies a non-gentrifying neighborhood, and she was comparing those indicators with neighborhoods in New York that were considered to be gentrified or potentially gentrifying or non-gentrified. The lighter shade of blue-green signifies a potentially gentrifying neighborhood, and Strongen labeled 12 of the 39 census tracts as potentially gentrifying through a comparison with those gentrification patterns in New York. And as you can see, New Urban Arts, which is represented by that gold star in the center of the map, New Urban Arts is surrounded by potentially gentrifying neighborhoods. And 11 of the 12 tracts that are potentially gentrifying are also places where the majority of New Urban Arts youth participants live, with the exception of the downtown area. The gray, by the way, just signifies a higher income neighborhood, or in the case of Fox Point on the east side, a long ago gentrified neighborhood. When I started to ask former youth participants of New Urban Arts, and I think I shared this quote the first time I presented at Ohio State, when I started to ask former youth participants of New Urban Arts about gentrification, they would often tell me about their first time seeing a white person in their neighborhood doing something that they were not accustomed to seeing, like the first white guy standing in line at a Dominican food truck, or white people jogging on the south side of Providence. So while I'm not making any claims in this book about whether or not particular neighborhoods in Providence should be considered gentrified or the city is gentrified, I'm suggesting that young people in my research were expressing a fear and a dislike of losing their neighborhoods as a result of a newfound white presence. And they describe losing a sense of control over how their community develops, how their neighborhood is culturally expressed, and whether their neighborhood will remain affordable to them, which you can see throughout this quote, and references to what kind of food is appearing in the neighborhood, how it's being paid for with, for example, credit cards, what that means. What does that mean for this person? On the other hand, I also found youth perspectives in my research that were supportive of this and perhaps complicit in this gentrified vision of the city. For example, in this quote, a youth participant of New Urban Arts articulates her vision of upward social mobility, her American dream. Her American dream is not a suburban house with a white picket fence, she said. It's a spacious red brick loft with good city views. So her vision of upward social mobility is consistent with Richard Florida's vision for the creative class and how and where the creative class is going to live. One might say that she's being interpolated or brought into being discursively as a person who desires the transformation of old red brick warehouses into trendy lofts. This desire is not a private one, but a socially constructed one that is entangled in the workings of capital and power. And one interpretation is that she's being cultivated as a gentrifying force in her own neighborhood, in her own city. We should expect to see these complexities and contradictions because dominant ideologies are always contradictory, as Stuart Hall reminded us. Successful or ruling ideologies, that is, ideologies which secure broad political consent, such as the creative capital, suture together, as Hall puts it, contradictory lines of argument and emotional investments in order to succeed. And in the context of the creative capital, there are a host of contradictory lines of argument and emotional investment. There is the emotional investment that in the need to develop a city that has experienced real hard times as a result of deindustrialization and globalization. There's an emotional investment in creativity as a good thing, that it contributes to healthy and happy lives and therefore better communities. There is a liberal humanist view that creativity is expressed through and should be celebrated in various cultural forms. And there's a neoliberal view that creativity gives entrepreneurs an edge in the gig economy, the knowledge economy, the platform economy, or what have you. And also that creativity gives cities an edge in this global marketplace and cities' competition for creative talent. And there's a liberal democratic investment in creative education as a great equalizer so that everyone has an equal shot in that creative economy. And there is a white settler spatial imaginary that appreciates creativity as an image and a lifestyle that enhances the value of land as a site for speculative investment. This list isn't exhaustive, but my point is that creativity as a discourse was so effective in bringing together people with varying and competing political interess. And as a contradictory discourse, we should expect to find these contradictions radiating through our lived experiences. As such, I became interested in my own lived experience and started doing some self-study and how I was being brought into being as a white creative in Providence and as a gentrifying force who is key to the future of the city. You know, paradoxically, the success of New Urban Arts depended on this subjectivity and its narratives because these narratives brought attention to the organization and expanded support for it and fit very, very nicely with the narrative that was emerging around urban renewal in the city. So now, you know, in retrospect, it's very hard to imagine New Urban Arts succeeding without this interpenetration between what we were doing in the studio and what the new vision was for how to drive urban renewal in the city. So this slide features some snippets from press coverage in Providence. And you'll see how I was being made known as an unusual sort of inner city hero, one who found an intuitive calling to follow my passion and empower youth. I was being brought into being as a white savior who was transforming youth of color through creativity. And more than that, I was also a symbol of urban progress, whereby white people were returning to the city and giving it an uplift. Denmeade's Urban Uplift was the heading of the editorial that the Providence Journal Bulletin, the city's major newspaper, wrote when I announced that I was stepping down from New Urban Arts. And, you know, it was suggesting that I returned to Providence after graduate school to run for mayor. So there was this link between my own narrative, what I had done in the city, and the vision for the city's future prosperity. By contrast, we can look at how the youth of New Urban Arts were being interpolated differently. So in this quote, we hear from Richard Lupo, who was a longtime concert owner, a venue owner in Providence, who was quite skeptical about these urban redevelopment projects that were underway in the name of creativity, largely because they were threatening his, well, I'm not sure, but I imagine partly because it was threatening his venue. He pointed out that major property developers in the city were concerned that white people and investment would not flow back into the city as long as the image of the city consisted of cars going by at night with, as he puts it, 4 or 5 scary youths. So this is the part of the spatial and racial imaginary of the city that was being understood as inhibiting white people returning to the city and capital investment coming in back into the city. And using this racially coded language, I mean, Christina Sharp might refer to scary youth as an example of anagrammatical Blackness, where Blackness is not named. You find it amidst scrambled letters like scary. So the scary is meant to surface the fears and anxieties that whiteness projects onto Black people and Black youth in particular. In Providence at that time, scary youth might also refer to youth who were members of refugee communities that had resettled in Providence after the Cambodian genocide, and some of them were participating in youth gangs in the early 1990s. And there were also white anxieties about waves of immigration to Providence from Latin America. And these youths were scary to whiteness because they signaled a future in which white political control in the city would be threatened. So scary youth are constructed as barriers to urban redevelopment and white investment now and in the future. And by contrast, white youth such as myself became symbolic of urban progress and a white urban future. Key for me here is that this field of racial signification is constructing subjectivities relationally through comparing white youth, say from Brown and RISD, and non-white youth, say from the public schools, and projecting those meanings onto visions for urban futures. It is within this relational and racist context that we must consider education and the imagined role of the creative sector in transforming what the city's Creative City plan called troubled youth, another, some more coded language. This plan included a well-intentioned effort to leverage support for arts education in the city through making the case that the creative sector artists were effective and powerful educators. And so it was making this argument. And this argument led to real material support for places like New Urban Arts and other youth organizations in the city. It provided employment opportunities for artists, and it provided employment opportunities for young people too. So, you know, there was a direct outcome from including youth and arts education, positive outcome from including youth and arts education in the Creative City plan. At the same time, you know, it did so by resorting to this relational construction between creative youth and troubled youth. What's interesting about New Urban Arts is that each year members of this local creative sector are chosen by youth of New Urban Arts to work with them as artist mentors. So artist mentors are artists apply to become artist mentors, and youth interview and select them, and then they volunteer in the studio for a year. And many of these artist mentors that have been selected over the years have attended or graduated from Brown University and the Rhode Island School of Design, these two elite institutions in Providence known for producing critical and creative thinkers. And, you know, the Creative City plan is trying to keep the young alumni from those schools in town, you know, from leaving, because, you know, to animate and kickstart the cultural and economic life of the city, as I was doing as a quote unquote social entrepreneur or arts educator or whatever you want to call me. So what makes New Urban Arts a compelling place to study the problem of youth in the creative capital is a place where these two constructions collide. Artist mentors who are typified as creative youth and youth participants who are typified as troubled or scary youth. In this quote from an interview with a former youth participant, we learn about how and why she expresses some misgivings about her relationships that she formed with these artist mentors. She couldn't figure out how they were living in broken down houses and warehouses with no heating, not earning any money from their artwork, and at the same time going to a high priced organic grocery store to buy food or Whole Foods. And she describes later that they, like me, had inherited a private safety net from their families, and that they, like me, had social and cultural capital accrued through elite university degrees. And she notes how she idolized these artist mentors before realizing that imitating their lifestyles would, in effect, reproduce her own material reality. As she puts it, that is my reality, but without the Whole Foods. So this passage calls into question what it exactly means for troubled youth to be transformed into creative youth, as was spelled out by the Creative City Plan. Yes, they could imitate their artist mentors and perhaps gain some cultural status and provenance by living in broken down homes, working on commission, and giving away their silkscreen posters for free, participating in this bohemian creative scene. But then she realizes that that would reproduce her reality, at least materially speaking. So then how does this transformation work for her as a vision for upward social mobility? Unlike the artist mentors, she would not be gaining any cultural status by rejecting her economic background through adopting this lifestyle. She would be reproducing it. Of course, artists living in broken down homes and low-income neighborhoods is a familiar trope in gentrification stories. In their paper on the role of the art scene in gentrifying the Lower East Side of New York in the early 80s, Rosalind Deutsch and Kara Ryan point out that artists and art institutions accrued cultural status as rebellious risk takers through placing themselves in proximity to low-income communities and communities of color. Artists became, therefore, what critical geographer Neil Smith called the shock troops of gentrification. They move into low-income communities and displace people before ultimately becoming displaced themselves as the rents move higher. But this cultural status of being an edgy artist and urban pioneer, so to speak, depends upon a white spatial imaginary. Low-income urban neighborhoods and neighborhoods occupied by people of color become constructed in racist terms as uninhabited space, culturally deprived space, or dangerous space. White artists then become positioned as cutting-edge risk takers through locating themselves on this so-called neo-frontier. And that's part of how they gain cultural status in this narrative. So if we reflect back on the previous quote by that former youth participant, we notice something curious about how she's positioned within this narrative. Her material reality would not change by adopting this creative lifestyle, as she notes. And while her new lifestyle might include cultural markers that are read in the creative capital as more proximate to whiteness, such as making silkscreen posters and giving them away for free, her cultural status might not accrue, or likely would not accrue, as much as theirs. One cannot gain the same cultural status as a pioneer in this gentrification story if one is from the neighborhood that is being gentrified. So I put forward the concept of the creative underclass to capture these complexities and contradictions for youth in the creative city. As much as this vision for creative-led urban renewal needed a creative class or youth like me, really the key point of this book is that showing that it also needed to construct this creative class relationally with an underclass or a creative underclass. And the narrative, went like this: these youths, scary youths, troubled youths, this underclass troubled cities, thus legitimizing the need to gentrify cities. At the same time, this underclass could be transformed by the creative sector, thus suggesting the creative city was an inclusive and meritocratic one. And the creative class could be thus positioned as a benevolent force, as I was, in that transformation, thus overshadowing the displacement of communities from their neighborhoods. And youth at Urban Arts and of course me in this book are reckoning with this complex and contradictory system of meaning as we figured out how to navigate it as artists, educators, and young people. New Urban Arts is also a place where young people trouble this system of meaning, this relational construction. And in the first half of the book, I spend quite a bit of time describing and interpreting, and I hope celebrating, many of the practices in terms outlined by young people themselves, in terms of how they're troubling their positioning as troubled youth. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll just introduce one of them, and that's which was probably my favorite, this idea of chillaxing. So in this passage, there is a young person named in the book, Lewis, who is giving new youth participants a tour of the studio. So this is one of the roles that young people would play in the studio. I'm thinking of Shirley Bryce Heath's work that talks about the multiple roles that young people play in places like this. And so one is to introduce new participants to the ways in which the place operates. And so Lewis leads his group to a place near the storefront that participants refer to as the Zen Zone. And he then introduces them to the space. And there's several things that interest me about this quote. First, Lewis is constructing himself as an out-of-touch adult authority figure who's giving the kids these days permission to hang out in the Zen Zone. In the Zen Zone, they could do things they like to do when they don't feel like making art. He gives them permission to hang out and text their friends. But his framing of hanging out in the Zen Zone points to its political and cultural significance for them. Hanging out is a cool thing to do because that's what creatives did or still do on the Parisian left bank, wearing their berets and drinking cappuccinos as they talk and read books. However, within the discursive logic of troubled youth, sitting on beanbags and texting and not making art in an arts after school program is not seen potentially as cool or productive. It's constructed as idleness or as a sign of cultural deprivation. So Lewis is unsettling this dynamic by performing an authoritative figure who instructs new members that they can come to the studio and be unproductive. They can come to the studio and chillax. So I started to ask young people about the politics of being unproductive in the studio and other ways they are troubling their position as troubled youth. And in this passage, Lunasol talks about the need to sit and hang out in the studio and not make art in relation to the racial battle fatigue she was experiencing after another day at school. So she, like a lot of participants at New Urban Arts at that time, went to a selective public high school that required passing an admissions test to get into it. And young people at New Urban Arts who attended this school often reported experiencing racial segregation and discrimination within the school. So while they were seen as potentially attending a school that would provide them pathway to university education, these were the kind of high performers in the public school district, they would then describe experiencing racial segregation and discrimination in the school, which would prevent that from happening. So she notes an example here where she's being told that she does not belong in an advanced placement class, which would allow her to secure some university credits. And her presumption is that she's being told that she does not belong in the AP class because she was racialized as Latina. After these kinds of encounters during the school day, she knows the significance of going to New Urban Arts and just sitting there and regrouping. This being unproductive, she notes, was a means of survival. And this being unproductive took the shape of talking. And for her, talking is just loving, and loving is beautiful. As I read her account and listened to the account in the interview, I was reminded that, as an arts administrator, I would never report to funders why it was crucial that young people have such spaces for peace and communion, where they can hang out and do nothing and where they can refuse the city's desire to transform them. You can imagine the difficulties that I had in writing this book, subjecting myself and the organization I founded to this kind of scrutiny. At the same time, there's still no doubt in my mind that spaces such as New Urban Arts matter, and they play an invaluable role in doing so many things for young people, including negotiating the problematic ways in which they are being typified through and subjected to racializing discourses, as we saw with the example of chillaxing, to care for one another amidst this field of signification with real material effects, as again, we see with chillaxing and talking as loving, and to experience joy and pleasure amidst their systematic denial elsewhere, as we see with the irreverence and messiness and celebration of New Urban Arts, and through cultivating their social and artistic practices, as we see with someone like Monty who went on to become a renowned web animator. And I wouldn't necessarily expect schools to be in a position to play these kinds of roles. So I think there's an important case for these programs, even amidst the scrutiny that I put forward of myself and my leadership. And I also hope that the book challenges us to reflect on the youth knowledge that is being generated in and through these programs, but are effectively silenced based on the power imbalances in the nonprofit sector. As I sort of mentioned, I would not have written this book if I were the director, and I couldn't have engaged in this analysis given my position as the director, because of both how I was being interpolated as a creative and how that interpolation mattered so much to the future of New Urban Arts, and also my fears about pleasing funders. Researchers are also, as we know, often complicit in this dynamic as they seek evidence that demonstrates youth impact in ways that pleases funders, and funders tend not to be interested in these critical forms of youth knowledge. But imagine the transformation of the sector and society if the critical forms of youth knowledge being generated in and through these programs was not silenced, but rather debated and discussed and used to value the programs themselves. This youth praxis, the one, for example, that I discussed today, chillaxing, it cuts against the grain of what funders, practitioners, and youth development researchers often will argue is best for so-called troubled youth or scary youth. So I think there's a real need to counter this epistemic violence and support the critical forms of youth knowledge production that is emerging in programs like New Urban Arts. And these critical forms of youth knowledge production can help inform urban development initiatives. So, looking beyond the borders of the studio, I'm not arguing against urban development per se, but I am arguing against displacement. And I am, aware of movements in urban policies such as development without displacement. And I think what this book shows is a real need for such initiatives, urban development initiatives, to actively counter the discursive and racist ways in which youth are constructed as troubled, as scary. And together, for me, all of these steps are part of a broader effort to counter a social and spatial imaginary that is invested in whiteness and that is shaped by the expansiveness of whiteness. So for me, this book is yet another in a long history of books that calls for white divestment. So that is my talk. I've been asked so Duke University Press is providing a discount if you are interested in getting the book. The code, you can use the code if you're interested in buying it, and if you're in North America, you can order it from the DUP website, and if you're elsewhere, there's the Combined Academic Publishers website, and you can use that coupon. Thanks so much for listening, and I will certainly look forward to your questions and comments.
Great, thank you, Dr. Denmead. We appreciate it. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and I also just want to remind everyone, if you are interested, you are more than welcome to just message me in the chat, and I'm happy to open up so that you can actually ask your question on your own, or we can turn on your video. That's also a possibility. So we did have a question that got posted while you were talking, Dr. Denmead, so I'm going to read that one. And if you can answer that, and then we can continue our discussion and dialogue, we can go from there. But thank you so much for your presentation. The first question we have here is from Lillian Lewis, and it's, what advice do you have for working class white art educators working in urban post-industrial communities to get started with supporting, facilitating creative opportunities for youth?
Hi, Lillian, and thank you for the question. So much advice. So, I mean, let's see. First, I would say, like, self-study, self-scrutiny, introspection about how and why one is going about this work is something that's never going to stop and shouldn't stop. So I think that's key. But more than that, like, how is one aligning oneself with particular political movements in cities? So what kind of ways is one engaging in activism in cities? So for me, for example, like, I mean, some of the mistakes that I made, right, was that I wasn't subjecting myself to that kind of scrutiny. I wasn't distancing myself and thinking about the ways in which I was being summoned as an educator. And instead, I was very quickly getting caught up in how my own success as an educator translated into success for New Urban Arts. I would say that a certain degree of walking lightly and being humble. I mean, if there was one thing that we did do well in the early days of New Urban Arts, is that we took it very, very slow in terms of talking to young people about what the kind of structure for New Urban Arts would entail, what it would look like, what our values were. And we spent so much time engaging in those collective and reflective conversations in such a way that I really do think that the youth culture of New Urban Arts that is so strong is a representation of those intentional efforts to honor their interests and their forms of leadership. And so that would be another piece of advice.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Dr. Rachel Skaggs. And she said, thanks for your talk. I would love to hear your suggestions for our students who might be interested in conducting critical embedded organizational research. In particular, could you speak to the time it takes to do this kind of work, how to balance publication requirements and ethical requirements to share this work with the organizations of study?
Yeah, okay, so can I hear the first part of that question? So how, again?
Yeah, so just, what kind of suggestions would you offer to students that are interested in doing this type of critical and embedded organizational research, and really speaking to the timing of doing this type of work?
Great, okay. So, I mean, one of the things that I really, really struggled with in terms of how to navigate this kind of research is that you could imagine that New Urban Arts investment in this research is that I would help and legitimize New Urban Arts and continue to play a kind of advocacy role for New Urban Arts. And in some ways, I think there was an understanding that the role that I would play was one of an evaluator, that was ultimately my role, not an ethnographer. And as much as I would try to say that I wasn't there to evaluate New Urban Arts and make the case and prove that it was producing positive outcomes, I don't think I ever was entirely effective at building that kind of understanding, which then raises questions of consent and what they were consenting to or not, and informed consent. So there's some real tricky issues there, I think, around being clear about what research is and what it means within the context of these programs. I do think at times, that's not to say that people within urban arts, for example, weren't interested over time in how to leverage this kind of research and for their own purposes. Like, for example, chillaxing in some ways was a product of funders coming into the studio and observing it and using observation tools and evaluation tools that kept showing that New Urban Arts wasn't doing anything, like, because they had the wrong tools that weren't allowing them to see what was happening there. And so, they were saying, could you resist this kind of audit and surveillance that's being done on the studio? Could you do that by highlighting the complex conditions of this place, particularly some of its temporal conditions, which chillaxing focuses on that. So I bring that up as a way of saying, like, there is a way in which I was working with people within New Urban Arts to think about how they were negotiating positions where they felt they were kind of in a weaker position of power with, say, policymakers and funders, and trying to use research as a way to combat that. To what extent that has had an effect, I'm not sure. In terms of the amount of time, I mean, this is something that I often talk about my students in terms of participatory research. I wasn't making the claim ever from the beginning with young people that I was doing participatory research, because my fellowship was for a year and I just didn't know where I was going to be or where I was going. And I thought there was going to be real challenges around being able to sustain a kind of relationship with participants and the studio in a way that I would consider to be participatory. I just didn't feel like I was capable of making that commitment. And so I had to be clear that that wasn't what I was going to be able to do. And I spent probably 6 hours a week in the studio that year. And I also had a very light teaching load that year. So I could spend so much time doing transcription and field notes and stuff. But then after that, it took 6-7 years to write this thing, and that included 2 semesters of leave where I was just focused entirely on it. So I mean, it was a major undertaking. I mean, it was also my first time ever trying to do this too, so it had a lot of stops and starts, and that and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. But that gives you a sense of the kind of time frame and expectations from the start.
There's a second part to that question. I just want to make sure too, if there's anything you want to add to that, is just sharing that work back with the organizations, folks that do this type of research, and then getting it back out to the people they're embedded with.
Yep. So I mean, as you could probably imagine, in the case of this book, that has been difficult, because this probably isn't the book that many at New Urban Arts probably thought I was going to write. So that has been difficult. It's very personal in Providence. So you can imagine that has introduced some challenges. On the other hand, I've been giving some of these talks, and there's been some former youth participants in the audience. So this talk has been one way that's been happening. These talks has been one way it's happening. But moving forward, I mean, what I want to do is make sure that I'm kind of working on a resource guide that I think would try to translate some of these findings both into that might be useful in teaching context, but also in youth development sector itself. So I'm still working on that. Another thing I would say that happened in the life cycle of this project was that, through the project itself was a site for this knowledge production, right? I mean, there was, for people in the organization to be critically reflecting on, for example, the idea of chillaxing. So like, it's not to say, I don't think it's as easy as saying like, you produce the book and then the book feeds back and informs what's happening. I think the book itself was a reflection of this moment in time in which young people were generating knowledge about what it is that they do and why it matters. And also in some cases, like, critically reflecting on what happens, at New Urban Arts when they, so I spent a lot of time interviewing, as you could tell, participants that I knew when I was the director there, but then had gone on. So they were now, like, at the time, they would have been 24, 25 years old. So this was a chance for them to sort of reflect critically on that experience of their lives in ways that, when I was the director of New Urban Arts, when I was putting young people in a position to speak about the organization, I was falling into the trap of having them tell stories about how New Urban Arts was saving them, right? I mean, that was what I was doing as the director of New Urban Arts. That was the kind of conversation that I was often having with young people when reflecting from a distance on the organization. And this was an entirely different kind of conversation through the research project itself. So I guess my answer to that question is to see the research as the site where the knowledge is being made.
Thank you. We've got another question. I'm going to read that here. It says, can you share how you had to negotiate your desires to complete a certain kind of research, but ended up with shifting the trajectory as new experiences presented themselves? That comes from Dr. Jody Akef.
That's a great question. I want to look at that again. Yeah, I mean, so negotiating my desires and negotiating my fears. I mean, I did not sleep a lot when I wrote this book, and I wrote 3 iterations of it. Some of my fears, some of my desires was like, I did not want to make this book about me. I did not want to recenter myself through this book. At the same time, I understood that, like, I was the urban problem that needed to be analyzed. And so it was the new experiences that were emerging were forcing me to recognize that the only honest book that I could write, and it was the book that I was afraid of writing at the time, was a book that subjected me to that kind of scrutiny. So, how I negotiated that was I relied a lot on people other than me like, to point it out for me and to guide me along the way. Probably most influential was a fellowship at the University of Illinois, where I was with 7 graduate students and 7 faculty for an entire semester, and we were presenting our work to each other every other week. And that's where really, like, the book that I was afraid of writing but knew I needed to write was emerging through that conversation. Yeah, I don't know if I have more to say about that. Not sure I answered that fully, but running towards the book I was afraid of writing.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yep.
So how had this process, so you took a great deal of time over time and depth of time in researching and analyzing and writing this. A couple points. If you had written the book you thought you were going to write initially, what might that have looked like, and how did this process as a researcher who is engaged in critical self-reflection, how has that changed you?
Yeah.
One of my perspectives on your work, Tyler, with this book in particular, is that this is the type of work that, I said this earlier, that we need to be doing as white people with privilege who are working in spaces. And so, as a white man with privilege, to me, this openness to critiquing your own thinking consistently throughout, it's a really difficult and hard and necessary process. And it obviously took you a great deal of time. So how has that changed you? And what might the book have looked like if you had not given it that time? Because so much of what we do in academia is so quick, because we are trying to meet these ridiculous expectations that don't lend themselves to critical work. And so that's a whole other story, but that's my lifelong journey in higher education.
No kidding. And I've made so many publication mistakes as a result of that pressure. I mean, I would say that one, and this perhaps helps get more fully at the question Joni asked too, is that, I mean, one of the stance that I took towards the book, ultimately the book that I wrote, and what's weird about the book that I wrote, the book that you're reading in the book, is that that you can read, is that book sort of came to being in about 3 months. I labored over books and books and books prior to this one. And then all of a sudden, something switched. I'm not quite sure what had happened. And maybe actually, I mean, part of it was the pressure of timeline, like, wait a second, I have been doing this for 25 years, but 7 in the terms of actual research. And then, I have this window of time and I'm gonna get it done. But it was also a kind of clarity around and understanding of a voice that I needed to bring to bear in the book, a level of scrutiny that I needed to bring to bear in the book. But it was also, I think, like a desire to use the book, as I sort of say in the acknowledgements, of kind of writing myself into a new position. There was a feeling always when I was writing this book, is like, do I really know what I'm saying? Like, this is always just like on the edge of who I am and what I'm capable of knowing. And that is a very, very vulnerable place to be as a scholar, where I was not writing from a position of expertise. I was writing from a position of like, I recognize that the person that this is not sufficient. And it's from that stance that I wrote, and I'm going to use the writing as trying to not arrive per se at some enlightened stance, but just move. So when I wrote that in the kind of first line of the acknowledgements, I think that's what I was trying to get at. And I think that's some of my, when I write well, that's what I'm doing. But it produces a ton of anxiety because I never feel like I'm writing from a position of strength or security. But I recognize that, like, that for this kind of study, that has to be the point. I don't know. It has to be the starting point. I also felt a certain responsibility to write this book because I knew, well, I mean, there weren't many people that were going to end up being in this position, right? Of like starting this organization, benefiting from for example, being seen as someone who's capable of doing this without really any credentials, and therefore getting all kinds of support and resources to do it, who then leaves, goes to graduate school on the backs of that narrative, and then gets a fellowship at Brown on the back of that narrative. Like, it never stopped propelling itself. And so there was a moment where I was like, okay, like, I am in a position where, like, given the critique that's being put out there, like, I cannot write the book that valorizes like what an after school program, like, that's just not possible. And it wouldn't be honest. So and I would recognize that I was in a unique position to tell this story, and so I felt like an obligation, I think, to tell it.
I was looking at Dr. Akos because I had a follow-up, but I didn't want to take. I think you can see her. Can you see her comment in the chat?
Yes, thank you for following up, contextualizing. Yeah, I appreciate the self-awareness.
One of the responses or questions, I follow up conversation there, since nobody else is putting one out there yet, because I could talk about this all day if given the opportunity. So, I think, so one of the things, again, that first of all, you could write another book about the writing of this book, in a sense, right? Like what it takes to go into that type of work as a scholar, as a white man in academia, like there's all these layers to it that, critique our ability to put out this type of work, which is what is needed to me more than I shouldn't say it that way, but to me, it's needed more than anything right now, is that, but so as a white ally who is also a scholar, we have to be willing to put ourselves in situations where we could have harm done to our own careers, our own selves. Like, we have to be willing to do those things if we want to call ourselves allies. And so I think that this scholarly work really represents that, because you talked about this quite a bit, that really calling out the critical aspects of this space, it was potentially damaging. I don't know if you use that word, but potentially damaging, one, to your relationship with them, and two, to their ability to secure funding moving forward, like all these layers. But we have to start having those honest conversations and being willing to put them out there, that in ways that we put ourselves at risk to I think, to really call ourselves allies. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I really struggled. I mean, one thing I haven't necessarily spoken about, but I have talked about in some other work, is, to what extent did this kind of self-criticality just end up ultimately recentering myself and my whiteness? So that was something that I was constantly wrestling with this book, is when and how and to what extent do I put myself into the story? And, theoretically, I was trying to find the theoretical resources to think less about me and myself, but more about this position and the subjectivity. And that kind of theoretical move made it much easier and much less personal, really, is to see myself as a social product. And so, for anyone who's interested in doing this kind of work, I would suggest that kind of orientation is useful. And it's important always, it's personal and it's not. So just keep that in mind.
I have a question, and you kind of had shared this while you were talking, but I really appreciate this about the book, and this comes up in some of the dialogue as your participants are talking, but this conversation around youth knowledge production and what's going on constantly through the process, not only in what they're doing through this research with you, but I'm really curious to know how you see that applicability going into like formal pre-K through 12 or higher ed sites, and and really centering those experiences versus right? Like using this as a potential launch point for how educators could start saying like, hey, maybe this is where we need to like really pull away and talk about what's going on and whether or not this is really actually benefiting, or if we are putting ourselves in savior situations, or right. And I think there's a variety of layers and conversations that I kept reading when I was going through the text. And so if you could speak to that, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as an educator, like, I don't know, was it when I was like in the 90s? Was it reading like Deborah Meyer's Power of Their Ideas? I can't remember. I might have read that as like an undergraduate, but there was always this sense of like, I remember going to a job interview at a university once where I was talking about university students as people who made knowledge. And the person like turned their head to the side and was like, "No, you teach. Like they learn. We're not making knowledge." And I was like, "Oh, right. This isn't gonna work. This isn't gonna work out." So my orientation has, and I sort of what kind of has always driven me as an educator is a kind of passion and investment in the ideas that emerge in this educational encounter. And I love the ideas of young people. I mean, chillaxing is like such a beautiful, such a powerful concept that it makes my life so much richer to know it. And so it is such an expansive and enriching approach to value and cherish, young people's ideas without like, I don't know, necessarily assuming like it's without romanticizing it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, that was certainly I hope that comes across in the book, that kind of eagerness and orientation and passion for that kind of knowledge. I should say also like, I mean, this critical knowledge production that emerges in that book is, I mean, some of my strongest interlocutors in the book, voices that are coming through. I mean, these are people that I had known for 10 to 15 years, which, like says a lot about like, these weren't, if I had just met them 3 weeks earlier, and actually I had this quite a bit, is that I came back to the studio in 2012 and I was introduced to young people as the founder. And so I had just a ton of young people coming up to me and just thanking me. And I could never get beyond that with them, actually. Like it was, and I was like, okay, well, this isn't that interesting to me, but yes, like, you're welcome. So it was actually like, and I didn't want to diminish like the significance of the place in their lives, but also like, so that position as the founder kind of complicated that knowledge production, but with people that I had known for 15 years, who like we had a record of critiquing ourselves and our relationship and the city and what we did in the studio. So we had a kind of long established practice of engaging in some of these conversations. So I guess, as much as I said earlier that I didn't imagine this being a participatory project because I didn't know where it was headed or where I was headed, I shouldn't downplay the extent to which there is at least a decade of relational work that is going into so much of that knowledge production. So I think that's important. It's important to keep in mind in terms of when we think about ourselves as researchers and educators doing this work with youth.
Thank you. I want to hold a minute for any other questions or chats.
These have been amazing questions. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. I'm going to share my screen and kind of take us to the closeout. I want to thank everybody that attended and joined us today. I really appreciate everyone's time. Again, I know how we've all engaged in Zoom world, and I'm so honored and pleased that we get to be together on this Friday and get a chance to connect. So I want us to just give again another thank you to Dr. Denmeade. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for presenting and sharing your book and the work you're doing. That's really so wonderful, and we're really glad to be here. Oh, you're raising your hand. Okay, go ahead. And we got a chat too. So here.
I meant to clap and I can't use Zoom.
Okay, that's okay. This is the beauty of Zoom.
Too late.
Yeah. We're very grateful. I do want to let everyone know if anyone needs anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, patel.648@osu.edu. I'm happy to continue to share conversation or ways that we can all connect even beyond this and the Barnett Speaker Series. And then my last slide is to invite you all to April 30th. We're going to have Elizabeth Coane share. And she's going to be talking about the magic is in the middle, philanthropy and the future of music in American cities. So we want to continue these dialogues. We want to continue these critical conversations and be together in this way. So I appreciate everyone's time and energy. Thank you, Dr. Denmeade, for joining us today. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. And I appreciate everyone's time and energy today. Bye. Take care all. Thanks.